Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the fourth. This is the fourth session of the PWL International Seminar. As you know, this seminar is hosted by IFILNOVA in the context of the FCT-funded project Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, and take place once a month in this virtual format. It is a great pleasure for me to have today with us Pedro Dotto, who won the postdoc scholarship offered by this project and is at the moment making a research stay with us here in Lisbon at IFILNOVA. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank Pedro for the great work he's been doing and for all the support he has been giving to the organization of the project's activities. It's really been great, Pedro, to have you here in Lisbon for these 6 months, and it's a pity that they are now coming to an end. I will now just very shortly introduce him to the ones who don't know him. Pedro Dotto defended his PhD dissertation in philosophy at the New School for Social Research in 2023. His doctoral dissertation undertook an analysis of Plato's Phaedrus that delved into the motive of psychagogy, or soul leading. You will say it in Greek, Pedro, as an interpretive key for understanding and unifying the dialogue. The thesis was acknowledged with the Hans Jonas Award for the best dissertation in philosophy. And currently, he's a research fellow in the graduate program in metaphysics at the University of Brasília and serves as an assistant editor for reviews in the journal Archive. He has published the book Uses of Freedom and Agonism in Michel Foucault in Portuguese by the publishing house Intermeios in 2018, and several articles and book chapters on Plato. As the scholarship holder of this project, he is currently working on the literary poetic topos of the choices of lives as the cultural background of the tradition of philosophy as a way of life, and the relationship between Plato's criticism of writing in the Phaedrus and philosophy as a way of life. It is precisely on this topic that Pedro is going to talk today. The title of his conference is The Criticism of Writing and Philosophy as a Way of Life in Plato's Phaedrus. So Pedro, please, thank you, and the word is yours.
No, thank you very much, Marta, for this very kind and generous presentation. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you all today as part of this beautiful cycle of conferences on philosophy as a way of life, and especially thrilled to offer this presentation to you all today as the scholarship holder of the project. And I've been enjoying, and it's been a fruitful time here in Lisbon, the IFILNOVA, for this scholarship. And with that said, I will begin. I'll share my screen and let me know, is my audio capture working out well? Okay.
Yes.
Let me share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so if there is any problem, just let me know. I have the PowerPoint presentation, also a paper from which I will read it so as to keep track of time, better. So with that said, I'll begin. The dramatic unfolding of the Phaedrus has a book as its springboard, the Biblion of Lysias, containing the praise of the non-lover. It is Lysias' book that facilitates the encounter between Phaedrus and Socrates and leads them outside the city walls for a calm and casual reading. The subject matter of Lysias' Logos is Eros, particularly against the backdrop of the homoerotic mentorship between an older man and a younger lad favored among upper-class Greeks, the so-called ancient paiderastia. Phaedrus was at first hoping to work out an exposition in general lines of the thought, the dianoian, behind Lysias' text, considering that he has memorized its exact wording, ta remata. But Socrates spots, in a passage with light erotic overtones, that Phaedrus holds the papyrus roll containing Lysias' speech in his left arm, under the cloak. So, given that Lysias is actually present, parontos ekai Lucio, Socrates urges Phaedrus to read his speech out loud as soon as they find a convenient location. So, and this is my first slide quotation from the beginning of the dialogue, and I'll come back to it later on. So I will read it. Phaedrus says, I did not learn it word for word, so taremata, but I shall run through the purport, the anoyan, of just about everything in which he said the situation of the lover was different from that of the non-lover, giving a summary of each in turn, beginning from the first. Socrates responds, yes, my dear fellow, after you've shown me just what it is you have in your left hand under your clock, for I suspect you have the speech itself, ton logon auton. If that is so, you must accept my position, that fond as I am of you, if Lysias is also here, I'm not really inclined to offer myself to you to practice on. Come now, throw it to me. So, despite Socrates' statements about Lysias being present, parontos e kalyusio, as you can see in the screen, Lysias, the author of the text, is absent, whereas in fact present is his written logos, ton logon auton, on behalf of the non-lover, which will be recited by Phaedrus during that summer day, accompanied by the chorus of the cicadas and by the river Ilissus. The graphic signs from the papyrus roll are uttered by Phaedrus in his act of reading, and thus the silent letters become meaningful sounds. In other words, in the process of reading, Phaedrus is lending his voice to the text, such that Lysias, the author of this text, can speak through him. Elaborating on the work of Jesper Svembro on the anthropology of reading in ancient Greece, one comes to realize that written communication was conceptualized after the fashion of the Greek social cultural practice of ancient paiderastia. According to this model, the writer is understood as a lover, an erastes, who seduces, manipulates, and subdues the reader as his beloved, his eromenos, or paidika, so in the condition of his passive instrument. This renewed understanding of the writer-reader relationship in Greece makes Plato's critique against writing the Phaedrus more striking, as well as the connection between the two halves of the dialogue. As Svembro writes, the reader is the instrument necessary for the text to be realized. The reader is at the active end of this relationship mediated by the text, whereas the reader is in a sense passive, a mere vehicle, a tool to make the words of the author resound. From a wealth of epigraphical, iconographic, and literary data, Svembro contrasts that Greek homoeroticism holds out a conceptual framework through which the relationship between writer and reader was conceived in classical Greece. I limit myself, since the time is short, to briefly relate some evidence gathered by him in support of his thesis, because this is going to be important for my reading of the criticism of writing the Phaedrus. So, a black Attic wine-drinking cup, possibly from Gela, Sicily, dating from around 500 BCE, perhaps even earlier, has an inscription with the following sentence, as reconstructed by the classicist Carlo Galavotti. O de grapsas ton anemonta pigisdei. Translating, the one who has written this inscription will sodomize the reader. Reading is associated with the passive position in the homoerotic relationship. According to the inscription, reading means finding oneself in the passive role, while the man who writes, the author of the text, identifies with the active, dominant, and self-imposing partner in a paiderastic relationship, as Svembro observes. As it were, the reader is penetrated by the writer as he's putting his vocal apparatus at the service of the author's words and intentions. The beloved gives his favor to the lover by submitting to the sexual act. Likewise, by analogy, the reader satisfies the writer by yielding to the reading activity. From roughly the same period, there is also a painting on the interior of an Attic red-figured cup of a beardless young man reading an inscription from a stele. His aspect is certainly that of a sororter eromenos. He is bending forward to read the inscription in the stele, and his backside becomes overt. This position, as Svembro observes based on Kenneth Dover's famous collected imagery on Greek homosexuality, is that of the katapygon, i.e. the man who passively submits to penetration. The young man is giving himself to the role of the reader qua eromenos, one without moderation and decorum, in addition. Because of the potential and ambiguous identification of the reader as a passive, instrumental, and submissive beloved, it is not uncommon that the act of reading be carried out by a slave, as portrayed in Plato's Titus. From this research by Sven Bron, paiderastia as a paradigm for the writer-reader relationship, I turn back to the Phaedrus and its criticism of writing. That the act of reading is also included in the criticism of writing should be evident from the many scenes of reading it depicts, among some passages from the Egyptian myth, which I'll get there. As I noted first, the first slide, the first encounter, the first conversation between Phaedrus and Socrates, the dramatic action of the dialogue is launched by Phaedrus' infatuation with Lysias' written texts, and it acts out diverse scenes or instances of reading. So we have Phaedrus reading Lysias' Biblion. You can notice Phaedrus' spellbound reaction to the reading of the text, and Socrates and Phaedrus critically inspecting Lysias' logos in the latter half of the dialogue. You can see the textual evidence in the slide, the passages from the Phaedrus. So the dialogue, Phaedrus, is overall deeply concerned with the problem of reading, but no written text can educate an individual on the adequate attitude to be held in the face of itself, so in the face of the written text. For the development of such an attitude is the burden of the reader, and so is dependent upon his response and reaction to that which is written. The most the dialogue can accomplish is to display the right and the wrong attitudes and the set of aptitudes that have to be developed for the competent practice of reading. The right attitude with Socrates' examination of Lysias' Biblion and careful discussion with Phaedrus about his argument style and structure. So the third moment here, the slide. The wrong attitude will be Phaedrus' bewitchment by Lysias' Biblion and apply endeavor to memorize its precise wording, so taremata, so to know it by heart, to memorize it. By depicting these scenes of reading, the Phaedrus, the dialogue, is calling attention to the predicaments at stake in an uncritical reading, like the one the character Phaedrus exemplifies, by attaching himself so unquestioningly, so amorously and passively to Lysias' text. Similarly, by representing Socrates' critical analysis of Lysias' text in the second half of the dialogue, the Phaedrus, the dialogue, reviews the right attitudes that a reader should have towards a text, Platonic dialogues included. Svenbor's research allows a broad comprehension to be gained from Phaedrus' criticism of reading, which can be included under the broad heading of criticism of writing. The reader, as conceptualized under the conceptual framework of paiderastia, was naturally passive and servile in relation to the writer. And here you can all recall Foucault's second volume of the use of pleasures, his description of the paiderastic model, the active older man and the younger passive young boy. Phaedrus occupies this position by uncritically welcoming Lysias' text, agreeably reading it to the point of glowing with excitement during the act of reading, and by celebrating its author as the most skillful of present-day writers. This gullible submission to the authority of the written text is antithetical, is opposed to the collaborative search for truth of philosophy and the self-propelling nature of the soul, both of which are highlighted in the Palynode, in Socrates' great speech in the dialogue. Just as the Palynode is concerned with reimagining the social institution of paiderastia upon the basis of a deeper equality between lover and beloved in the philosophical quest for knowledge, the criticism of writing, qua criticism of reading, challenges the conventional paiderastic model underlying the writer-reader relationship because of its power imbalance and detachment from knowledge, virtue, cooperation, and truth. Next slide. To borrow the terminology from Phaedrus' Egyptian myth, In the act of reading, the reader is merely reminded from the outside, exoten, relying on external characters instead of recollecting knowledge with his own resources from the inside, so endoten. Books can furnish readers with the reputation of being wise, so doxosophoi, but this is altogether different from the deep-seated and self-sustaining striving after knowledge that philosophy embodies, and likewise from the true condition of wisdom that only gods enjoy. In this sense, the reformation of paiderastia and the criticism of writing go hand in hand, taking into account that paiderastia served as a conceptual model to think about the writer-reader relationship in classical Greece. But something like the mechanical passivity of the reader can arise in situations in which there are other communicative devices at play. The structural flaws of written texts, hence, can be seen as analogous, in different degrees, to some forms of oral communication. For the oral speech that stands in contrast with the written text is not just any oral speech, but more precisely, oral speech by an individual with knowledge, equipped with the dialectical method and with a didactic purpose, and who makes use of psychagogic rhetoric. And I will come back to this point about psychagogic rhetoric later on. Let me first delve deeper into the aspects of Plato's criticism of writing in the Phaedrus. So, what are the defects assigned by Socrates to writing as a means of communication? In my analysis, Socrates develops the criticism of writing four distinct about interrelated moments: the Egyptian myth, the analogy between writing and painting, the contrast between oral and written communication, and finally the recapitulation of what it means to compose a logos, be it oral or written, with techne, with art. So now let's examine closely the crux and the precise terms of the criticism of writing. Two shortcomings of writing come straightforwardly in the Egyptian myth, in the mouth of Thamus. First, writing generates forgetfulness instead of memory. Second, writing affords merely a veneer, a semblance of wisdom rather than true wisdom. So, doxosophia instead of sophia. These vices of writing are precisely the reverse of what Theot, the father of letters, the creator of letters, had claimed as its beneficial effects. When presenting the art of letters to Thamus, Theot had boasted that a drug, pharmacon, for memory and wisdom had been invented by him. Conversely, Thamus judged that writing is a drug of reminders, hypomnemata, instead of memory, mnemes, that it induces forgetfulness in the soul of its users from a trust piston in that which is written, and a corresponding lack of exercise of the mnemonic capacity of memory. Further, Thamus estimates that writing does not afford real wisdom, Sophia, but merely an appearance or reputation of wisdom, captured by that wonderful Platonic coinage, doxosophia. Following the Egyptian myth, Socrates raised more points that, on the one hand, qualify the extreme condemnation of writing from the Egyptian myth, whereas, on the other, expands on the defects of writing. Socrates carried out this new round of criticism not with the aid of a myth, but through an analogy between writing and painting, the so-called graphe zographia analogy. Socrates posited that every writing is confined to a condition of sepulchral silence. The text is in need of the reader to transpose its silent letters into meaningful, intelligible sound, just as I had previously argued. Otherwise stated, a text is deprived of resources to answer questions, address difficulties, and clarify doubts concerning its content. The text always expresses the same graphic signs in the same exact order and manner. Consequently, writing as a communication medium cannot adjust its message in the light of the singular soul it is currently addressing, as the philosopher ought to do, as Socrates claims that the philosopher ought to do, the second part of the dialogue. Just like painting, writing may have the semblance of being alive, owing to its realistic, lifelike qualities, but this is nothing but a pretense, a semblance, for paintings, as well as writings, are silent, stiff, and dead, i.e. soulless. The last line of Lysias' text accomplished this simulation of life with an ingenious formula, for it appealed to the reader directly, as if it were the author who were standing there behind the text instead of its dead letter. So I quote, you can see it on the slide. I indeed consider that my words are sufficient. However, if you still feel that something is missing on the belief that it was left aside in my speech, ask, erota. But the fact of the matter is that the author, Lysias, is not indissolubly attached to the text. So when these last words are voiced in Phaedrus' reading, Lysias, the author, cannot retort to any of the queries that can be raised to it, like the critical remarks launched by Socrates immediately after the reading session. Another problem related to the silence and fixity of writing that arise in the writing-painting analogy is what I might call its vulgarity. The papyrus roll containing the text circulates, pulling data everywhere around, exposing itself in the same way to those who are enlightened as much as to those who have no business with it, since the text doesn't know to whom it should speak and to whom it should keep quiet. Further, when the text is unfairly handled by a reader, the writing is dependent on its begetter, the author, the father, to defend, explain, and justify the arguments that have been written down. This is what I shall dub the helplessness of writing. Lysias, for instance, was not present to defend his text, despite that ironic utterance. And so Socrates reproves Lysias' logos, both in substance and style, along that sunny day of dialogue and discussion with Phaedrus by the river Ilissus. Similarly, you can see in the handout, Protagoras is not within the reach of the Titus to explain and defend his man-measure doctrine, nor Simonides is there in the Protagoras to help his verses by elucidating the meaning of his words and the intention behind his poem. In the third moment of the criticism, in comparing oral and written speeches, Socrates discerns and develops a few more defects of texts. At this juncture, and related to their helplessness, writing texts are incapable of teaching the truth competently or adequately, so teaching the truth ikanos. Nonetheless, to claim in a written text, such as a Platonic dialogue, the written text is incapable of teaching the truth ikanos, so adequately, brings about an interesting self-referential paradox, as you can see in the slide. So, for if the criticism of writing is found to be convincing and true, then one contradicts the thesis stated in writing of the infeasibility of writing in the transmission of knowledge. But if the criticism of writing is found to be unconvincing and false, then one confirms the thesis stated in writing of the unfeasibility of writing in the transmission of knowledge. So if you agree with the Phaedrus that the writing cannot preach the truth adequately, you contradict it because it has taught you the truth. If you disagree with it, if you disagree with this claim, then you confirm it. So in this sense, that it is a self-referential paradox to present a criticism of writing, the writing itself. In this light, the writing appears to refute itself, just like the philosophical author has to be capable of refuting what he wrote. All in all, writing appears to be an improper method of philosophical instruction. But hadn't Socrates, by the way of alleviating Phaedrus' disbelief in the Egyptian story, in the Egyptian myth, that what matters the most in communication is the truth, aletheia, of what is uttered, rather than the authority of the utterer, if the truth is uttered by an oak or a rock, as Socrates mentions with respect to the sanctuary of Zeus of Dodona, or for the matters, by a text such as the Delphic inscription, to Delphicon Gramma, about self-knowledge that Socrates takes to the heart, would the source and medium of the utterance be relevant? Or what counts the most is if a soul is competent in putting the utterance to the test and discovering its truth for itself, instead of simply receiving it from outside as a submissive eromenos. Beloved, shortly before presenting the Egyptian myth, Socrates gives these statements as a response to the question on the way to gratify the god to the highest degree. I quote, it's in the handout. I can at least say a dictum from those who have come before us, and they themselves know the truth. But if we ourselves were to discover this, the truth, then would any of the human opinions still matter to us? Carrying on with my analysis of the aspects of the criticism of writing, writing is reaffirmed as a reminder of good use only to those who are already knowledgeable, as well as for those who walk in the same path, who tread the same path. The status of texts and nothing but reminders had already loomed before in the context of the Egyptian myth, but now the scope of beneficiaries of the text as qua reminders, hypomnemata, is expanded to include not only those who know the subject matter referred in the text, but also those who fall in the same footprint, so tauton ignos. Third, by contrast with oral speeches, writing should be doomed to a state of infertility, as the metaphor of the garden of Adonis reply, the number 9 in the handout. The speech maneuvered by the dialectician for the instruction of a suitable soul, by contrast, is not sterile, but rather bears fruits that can proliferate in a never-ending cycle of cross-generation of knowledge over different generations. The fertility of oral speeches in a dialectical, didactic situation, in opposition to the garden of Adonis of writing letters, adds another layer to the overall opposition between life, oral speech, and death, written speech. The speeches of the dialecticians are his son, especially those within his own, but also the speeches that are generated through conversation and dialectical investigation in the soul of his fellow philosophers. But these speeches are not unilaterally communicated by the philosopher to his students, for this would reaffirm the power imbalance between lover and beloved, writer and reader, that is irreconcilable with the nature of philosophical inquiry and philosophical knowledge. Truth inheres already in the disciple's soul, as the Palinode, the great speech, recounts. And so knowledge must begin through recollection, anamnesis, i.e., it can only be brought about by each soul's own efforts, resources, and responsibility. Moreover, the suitability of the soul to be addressed by the philosopher, dialectician, is repeatedly stressed by Socrates as necessary for the art of speeches, and this is certainly a requirement that writing cannot satisfy in any straightforward manner. Finally, Socrates concedes the role of play to writing, but of a noble play, pankale paidian, to be sure, in comparison with drinking parties and the base forms of play and pleasure. While writing is placed under the class of play, the cultivation of knowledge through dialectical and dialectic conversation is put on the side of serious activity by Socrates. One should not lose sight that the criticism of writing is introduced in the course of a broader research program on what constitutes speaking and writing well, and this section falls into place immediately after Socrates' criticism of rhetoric. Within this enlarged context, Socrates had reaffirmed in the PowerPoint that the power of speech is so leading, so logo, dynamis, psychagogia, and noted that this is the property of speeches, and this property of speeches apply whether it's written or spoken speech, written or oral communication. The criticism of writing should not be abstracted from its dialogical contents. It's in fact part and parcel of a larger project undertaken in the second half of the Phaedrus of investigating the potentialities and limitations of logos, be it in oral or written modalities. From the analysis of the defects of writing expounded above, so inflexibility, stillness, helplessness, etc., it's clear that a living dialogue animated by a didactic spirit and equipped with the dialectical method gets the upper hand in fulfilling the capacity of logos for soul leading, so for psychagogia. This kind of logos, after all, is the living and ensouled speech of the dialectician and the legitimate brother of the writing speech, which even makes the writing speech comes out as an illusion, a shadow, an specter, an eidolon when confronted with it. The adaptability of the oral logos in the face of different recipients and the ability of the philosopher to respond to rebuttals and dispel doubts are the main features that make it superior and more suitable to the didactic relationship examined by Socrates in the context of the criticism of writing. It is of the essence of the soul to be a self-moving agent, as maintained in the Palinode, in the great speech, so that it is natural that a speech that is living and ensouled, instead of a speech that has only the appearance of liveliness, as it is presented by Socrates in this analogy between painting and writing would fare better as an instrument for teaching. Provided that oral speeches are dynamic, flexible, and responsible, improvable, and responsive to changing conditions, they are, as a general rule, more akin to the nature of the soul, qua self-motive power, and are also a better instrument for the task of teaching. Oral speeches are in principle capable of giving and receiving reasons, adjusting their content to the character of the addressee, and thus guiding a soul towards knowledge, virtue, and truth. This is the sense that communication is better and more effective, ameinon kai dunatoteros, than writing. Owing to its features and by contrast to the limitations of writings, oral speeches have a great psychagogic capacity, and this is the nature of the power of logos as such. From this perspective, the superiority of oral speeches is not dependent on an esoteric, intra-academic teaching that could be transmitted only through word of mouth. So, in contrast with the Tübingen Milano school, I uphold that what has greater value, so what is thimiotera, is not Plato's oral tenets on the fundamental principles of reality, i.e. his protology. Instead, what has greater value, what is thimiotera, is the dialectical knowledge that lies in the soul of the philosopher, and that enables him or her to come in support of the writings, while at the same time demonstrating the insignificance of written texts, since he knows where the truth really is, namely the soul. Another way of stressing the point is to bear in mind that doctrines, be they oral or written, have a subordinate role vis-a-vis the living practice of philosophizing. Doctrines, insofar as doctrines, i.e. a compendium of propositions that can be externalized and objectified in logos, be it written or oral logos, rely on the psyche that has first formulated them, and that can justify, elucidate, clarify, defend, and if necessary, revise them. The philosophical form of life that the Socrates of Plato's dialogue symbolizes is prior in significance to any sort of doctrine, and stands over and above the kind of knowledge that can be reduced without loss to logos. Knowledge is inscribed primarily in the soul, in the psyche, and not on words, on logoi, or written. Therefore, doctrines, be they written or unwritten doctrines, are and will always remain ancillarily to the living practice of philosophy, and so are subordinate to the souls of those who are wholehearted committed to the philosophical form of life. The text, as I tried to show, the written logos, cannot give reasons in defense and support of itself, apart from what has been externalized and fossilized in the form of its dead letters. But can any verbal utterance, solely because it is a verbal utterance, an oral speech, achieve such a feat? Could Lysias defend his epidatic speech, his praise of the non-lover, if he was there in the company of Phaedrus and Socrates by the river Ilissus in that sunny afternoon? Or is it more likely that Lysias would flounder, that Lysias would fail, as so many victims of the Socratic elenkos? The orators of the assembly, so often attacked in Plato's dialogues, as well as the sophists, wouldn't fare significantly better than a text if they were pressed by Socrates to justify their theses and stand by their claims. As observed in the Protagoras, the dialogue Protagoras 329a, most orators are exactly like books, posper biblia, and are consequently unable to ask and answer questions about what they have said. An epidatic speech shows many of the flaws of the written text, that it cannot give reasons to back up its claims and cannot guide itself according to the nature of the recipient, so it cannot adjust its content to the nature of the recipient. Even myths, as sophisticated as the Pinod, seem to share much of the shortcomings of written texts. In my view, behind the oral-written distinction, then, stands a much higher and Socratic in spirit distinction, namely that between knowledge and ignorance, or even philosophy, wisdom, and doxosophia. So Sophia, philosophia, and doxosophia, the pursuit of knowledge, knowledge that only God possesses, and the reputation of being wise. The soul is the bearer of knowledge, and not language in and of itself, be oral or in its oral or written modalities. Knowledge is not exhausted by the realm of language and is not reducible to the range of true propositions that an individual can put down. This knowledge debts or propositional knowledge would amount to nothing more than bookish knowledge, which can be objectified, memorized, and reproduced, like Lisa's text that Phaedrus is trying to memorize. And this is altogether different, it's altogether distinct from the search for wisdom that constitutes the life of the philosopher. True knowledge in my reading of the Phaedrus encompasses both propositions and dispositions. It's not limited to a compendium of true propositions about a given topic, for it includes skills, capacities, and sensibilities that simply cannot be captured or translated into knowledge of the propositional kind. The metaphor of the long and hard road of philosophizing that appears in Plato's Phaedrus and also in the Republic twice draws attention to the fact that the acquisition of philosophical knowledge is not equivalent to a mechanical learning of formulas and the passive assimilation of arguments and propositions or theories. The conventional beloved and the passive readers, and the conventional beloved and the passive reader are faulty instantiations of how to gain access to philosophical knowledge. Conversely, philosophical knowledge lies closer to our certain way of being and behaving in this world, our resolute willingness to procure self-knowledge and avoid self-deception, a cautious and rigorous handling of language, of logos, language, arguments, a heightened sensibility towards beauty, and a deep-seated concern for truth. As Pierre Hadot once wrote, when commenting in a preface on a book on the Plato's oral teaching, and I quote, it is in the slide, "What is more, to put writing in its rightful place, which is entirely relative, let's add that true philosophy is neither oral nor written speech, but a way of being. Philosophizing does not consist in speaking or writing, but in being. You must transform your whole soul in order to contemplate the idea of the good. Here we reach the limits of language, so the limits of logos. It should be relatively apparent by now, I hope, that the criticism of writing from the Phaedrus is not equivalent to a condemnation of writing tout court, as it's often made out to be. I comprehend the meaning of such a critique in a Kantian spirit, that is to say, as an examination and demarcation of the boundaries of possibility proper to writing, instead of an outright execration of writing. As Socrates puts forward, the investigation that he is conducting with Phaedrus in the second half of the dialogue concerns the criteria for writing and speaking well, kalos, in a convenient fashion. So, eupropeias instead of aprepeias, in a manner, moreover, that is pleasing to the gods. But writing speeches, as Socrates concedes from the outset of the inquiry, is not in and of itself shameful, aiskron. What is more, a fact seldom noted by scholars is that Socrates invokes the Delphic writing, you can see it in the slide, to Delphicon gramma, the passage there, to support his quest for self-knowledge at the beginning of the dialogue. What suggests that written letters, or grammata, can presumably have a positive effect, at least to a certain extent. Even if certain use of oral speeches is placed first by Socrates, for it fulfills, as far as possible, the psychagogic dynamis, the psychagogic power that is the nature, the physis of logos as such, there's a sense in which Socrates does make room for the writing activity. A good way to address this issue is to compare the criticism of rhetoric to the criticism of writing. Just as Socrates rejects the conventional rhetoric of Theseus, Gorgias, etc., Thrasymachus, while endorsing a superior type of rhetoric, he also repudiates a certain form of writing while accommodating another kind of writing, which goes on a pair with a new attitude towards writing. It's far from doubt that Socrates is considering written speeches in the broadest possible sense, for it specifies that it's every speech whatsoever that was written with or without third verse, and mentions next the name of Lysias, Homer, and Solon to cover the range of prose, poetry, and political writings. In this all-encompassing approach to writing as a form of logos, what are the conditions that Socrates lays down for one to write and still merit the title of a philosopher? Let us see the next slide. If a knowledgeable person has the truth to which he has put together these written compositions and is capable of helping them, the writings, by his proceeding examination and refutation concerning those things which he has written about, the subject matter of the written speech. And he himself is capable in speech to show the poetriness of the writing. So the first condition is knowledge of the subject matter referred to or represented by the written letters. If it is a text, say, on the construction and maintenance of iron bridges, then the author must know about the construction and maintenance of iron bridges to put it on paper. The second condition is that the author be capable of helping the text by defending, justifying, and further explaining what was written down when submitting it to critical examination. This is precisely what the written text, as a medium of communication, cannot achieve of its own, as it is structurally dependent on the author to come into its aid when called into question and unjustly abused by readers. As Ernst Reich succinctly puts it, quote, rhetorical competence is grounded directly on competence over subject matter. Presumably, is the condition 1 that provides the means for condition 2, that is the knowledge in the soul of the author that allows him or her to support and stand by the text. Finally, condition 3 is that the author must be conscious of the limitations of writing as a communicational medium, as Socrates had addressed and examined in the preceding. So the philosophical author must be capable in an oral exposition to point out the limitations that make writing inferior as a mode of communication in comparison with dialectical investigation. If all the conditions expounded in this passage in this slide are met, then an author should not be named after his written works, but rather as a philosopher. That's what Socrates claims immediately after this passage. As the investigation on writing departed from the proposition that writing is not in and of itself shameful, it wraps up on that same note at 277d1-4. Socrates reiterates his thesis to make it perfectly plain to Phaedrus. What is shameful, as Socrates contends, is being ignorant in the most serious matters, justice and injustice, goodness and badness, etc., and winning the applauses of the multitude by nevertheless pretending to have such moral knowledge. Thus, Socrates does not operate with a double standard in his appraisal of speeches. True and true, during this entire second half of the Phaedrus, the same criteria are invoked for the appraisal of logos. The dialogue form adopted by Plato can alleviate some of the perils at stake in writing, but it cannot break away from its structural flaws. At the end of the day, knowledge has to be conquered by each soul in its search for the truth, following the trail of logos. Next slide. As Plato has his Socrates says elsewhere in the Phaedo, think little of Socrates, but much more of the truth, which anticipates that saying by Aristotle that more than a friend of Plato, I'm a friend of the truth. It was already in Plato before Aristotle. Plato was more committed to truth than with the words of particular authors. I am attempted to paraphrase this sentence by Socrates in the following way. Think little of my writings, but much more of the truth. Well, it's in this precise sense that Plato's dialogues, all of them, no exception, would have as their subtitle that same lapidary sentence that Nietzsche engraved in his Zarathustra, a book for everyone and for no one. For everyone, since, according to the teaching of recollection, anamnesis, knowledge already exists in human souls, and it needs only to be stimulated, developed, and perfected by each individual. For no one, because Platonic dialogues cannot provide pieces of knowledge without some effort and work from the part of the reader, without that burden of the reader. So Plato's understanding of what philosophy is, accordingly, is intrinsically interwoven with how he has decided to put into writing, that is the dialogue form. The dialogue form that Plato has chosen and crafted leaves all the theses, doctrines, arguments, and theories expounded on them by their characters open for further discussion, deeper examination, and renewed assessment. By doing so, they provoke the reader to take an active and critical stance concerning the theses, doctrines, arguments, and theories presented therein. In other words, Platonic dialogues do not want the reader to be simply a passive beloved, a passive eromenos, but invites him or her to take part in a collaborative and continuing quest for knowledge. Again, Plato's reformation in paiderastia and the criticism of writing go hand in hand, and also with the teaching of anamnesis, recollection. I'm getting to the end. Platonic dialogues, consequently, should be conceived as both instantiations of and intimations to philosophy, propositional arguments and the analysis thereof, just as much as non-propositional, so protreptic, reflexive, non-objectifiable, life-altering. The reason is that, as the Phaedrus suggests, the dialogue, not the character, even if an argument may be learned by heart and recited, so taremata from the first passage quoted, this would not be sufficient for one to become a philosopher. Truth is not a property of speeches, and knowledge should be inscribed within the soul instead of an external support. For instance, speeches, sentences, books. The teaching of recollection implies that knowledge is a non-transferable realization, a personal achievement, the desire for which is deep-seated within each soul, and this is couched into a mythical narrative about the origin and destiny of human souls. So their arche and telos. In this light, the teaching of recollection converges with the criticism of writing. Both of these are predicated on the guiding thought, the master thought, that philosophical knowledge cannot be simply delivered from without, exoten, but must rather be conquered and sustained by each soul with its own resources, efforts, and care, so endoten, not exoten. Knowledge cannot be handed over or carried around under one's cloak, like Lysia's speech, Lysia's logos, that Phaedrus bears, remind you of the first slide, because knowledge is not an objectifiable entity of such a kind, but rather a dynamic capacity that can give an account of its reasons as the reasons they are, defend claims, adapt a line of reasoning according to a given interlocutor, withhold its words whenever necessary, and instruct into the way of truth. In this sense, the spirit that Socrates is mostly concerned with is the one that is written with knowledge in the soul, and which is insusceptible to exteriorization without loss in any material support. So to conclude and to sum up, only the soul is the subject of knowledge. The object of knowledge is the forms qua ultima structures of reality. The medium of knowledge is logos, broadly speaking, but the oral speech of the philosopher, the dialectician, is better, more direct and immediate than written text as a stimulus for the attainment of knowledge. Written texts have structural defects such as the incapacity of explaining their reasoning, adjusting their content to different interlocutors, and elucidating doubts. Such defects are also common to epidatic speeches from sophists, mythical rhapsodies from poets, and public oratory from politicians. But written texts can perhaps spur knowledge in a soul, even in a more indirect, unreliable, and problematic way, as Socrates' reference to the Delphic writing, to the Delphicon grammar, and his quest for self-knowledge seem to invite, seem to suggest. Otherwise stated, self-knowledge is grounded on a personal, inner, steadfast striving to examine oneself and avoid self-delusion. The Delphic inscription can at most serve as an external reminder for one to engage in the activity of knowing oneself, but this activity cannot be undertaken by anyone else. Platonic dialogues might work in precisely this way, as an invitation and provocation to engage in philosophical inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro, for this very clear and illuminating talk. Thank you also for respecting the time. We have now more than a half an hour for the discussion. But before we start the discussion, I would like to give the word to a colleague in the audience who, perhaps inspired by the topic of this talk, wishes to make an announcement. Misko, please, you can have the word now.
Thank you. Am I heard?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. At the beginning, of course, I would like to thank you very much for the lecture about the dialogue, which has a special meaning for me. I will get to it in a few moments. First, however, Marta kindly allowed me to do a small advertising break. And I hope that because of its subject, today's hero, Dr. Pedro Dotto, will not be offended.
Not at all.
Every summer there is held in Poland the Summer School of Spoken Latin made by Polish Philological Association. In recent years, organized in my city, Wrocław, by the Classical Philology in University of Wrocław. It is completely international. There were, for example, Mexicans and last time some priests from USA. It seems to be very related to today's topic, not only because the exercise of ancient languages is very useful in philosophy and spiritual exercise, but also because it deals strongly with orality and literacy. It's an intensive 2-week course in spoken Latin, as I said, and speaking Latin also about completely modern times, talking about Latin as a living language. So an ancient model, a contemporary approach. So thank you very much to Marta for the opportunity to give this information and encouragement. I believe it's worthwhile because there are few such schools in the world, and this one is run by professionals, not only from Poland. And there are groups from both complete beginners and veterans, all in Latin. Okay, there is a bit of ancient Greek too. In a few minutes, I will pass the relevant link and email and some information on the chat. But as you know, this is the most important thing today. As I said, Phaedrus is very special for me. I think now it's this part in the end of Phaedrus is probably second most important part of philosophical works in my life. So thank you very much again. I didn't read Svenro, I have to. Of course, that is why I should have many questions, but everybody needs time, so there will be one big question. As we all know, we are in an extremely strange situation now, just as there was a certain communication revolution in Plato's time, what we can see in Phaedrus, no less is happening today due to media and technology revolution. Perhaps this was best written by Walter Ong in his Orality and Literacy, which I sincerely and gladly recommend to anyone who doesn't know it. But that was 50 years ago, and today 50 years is much longer than in Plato's time. So look at the seminar. We are talking far away from each other, looking at each other, but nevertheless, it is not an ordinary conversation, although something more than a phone call. We are talking, but there are other trees around us and other birds, other cities, and even a different time. I don't know if we are now in Brazil or in Portugal, but it's not the same time as in Poland. So in fact, we persist in different contexts and different circumstances. I can look now at your FIDI dissertation at academia.edu and check which one from my favorite thinkers you quoted and which not. There is no Walter Ong, I also said, but I didn't read Svenbro. And I can do it even without reading the book. There's a clear ontological and therefore ethical difference between such a conversation and the conversation from Phaedrus. So my question is this: what do you think Plato would have written, or Plato's Socrates would have said about the 21st century revolution in communication and social media? Or on a slightly different note, is our conversation an ontologically close contact to the dialectical conversation from Phaedrus, or it is not? Are there similar dialogues, or are they not? Thank you. This is my question. Maybe it was too long, but I hope it was understood.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Should I respond each one?
Yes.
Or yes,
Yes,
better,
Pedro,
right?
please,
I
yes.
think it's better as well. Thank you very much for the announcement, Nisco, also for the reference. If you could please write down the reference in the chat about the wrong, we appreciate it. It's hard to think about what Plato or Socrates would have understood of 21st century as time so boring for them. And I have to admit, I haven't thought about the revolution in social media brought about by the communication devices and the relation with Phaedrus, but I've thought already about the ChatGPT and all these kinds of artificial intelligence, which is different. But I think that Phaedrus' criticism of writing can apply to a great deal to this artificial intelligence methods, in the sense that they one could make a distinction here among ourselves between knowledge and information. Artificial intelligence gives you information, but it not gives you knowledge. It can help a student, say in the school to make homework, but this is not the same thing as making the student acquire such a knowledge, absorb this knowledge, make new connection, and relate this piece of knowledge with other beliefs that the student might harbor inside. So in the sense that I think that there are some parallels that can be drawn between Plato's criticism of writing and the limitations of AI, ChatGPT, and all other such devices. But for the social media, this distance communication, the Zoom, Skype, and so on, I honestly cannot say. I haven't thought about it. It's definitely not the same as dialectical investigation in the Socratic sense, only because dialectical conversation in this Socratic sense is not done only once. It has to be something repeated. It's synonymia, synontos. It's to live together and discuss the same topics over and over again. I think that this communication device can certainly facilitate this encounter. And look at us discussing philosophy and clarifying doubts. It's not just reading a paper or a book or dissertation that you found in the library and then wondering about what the author has taught and what how could the author answer some doubts of yours. We can speak and look of ourselves. It's not in person, I grant that, and there is a qualitative difference, I think, between having a in-person discussion with all of us together in the same room for an entire afternoon, a workshop, and it's also qualitative different from from being together and discussing the same topics over and over again, getting back to them, rehearsing same thesis, thinking about new arguments, which I think it's the kind of commitment that Socratic dialectics entail. So it's not a complete answer, but it's what I can give you so far, Nisco, but thank you.
Thank you. To be honest, I didn't even thought about artificial intelligence, so because those are quite old thoughts. So thank you. It is a good way to think later. Thanks.
Thank you both. I will now give the word to Annie. Annie Larivier.
Thank you, Marta. And thank you so much, Dr. Dotto. It was a pretty impressive talk. We could definitely see that you have written a dissertation on the topic. It was so rich, and I wish I wish I could have read your talk before the Zoom encounter to be sure that I really get what you're trying to express here, which is paradoxical given the theme of your presentation. So I don't know exactly if I have a question or an objection. I think I agree with you with pretty much everything, but I would need a clarification because it seems like what the relationship between or the way philosophical knowledge can relate to writing and be good or bad, or be done rightly or wrongly, is not fundamentally different than what applies to any other type of knowledge. And Socrates mentions medicine in the Phaedrus as a kind of paradigm to explain what he means when he talks about difference between a speech or a written text that doesn't have knowledge and the real possession of knowledge of the physician, who does not only know what medication will make you will induce a purge, or the medical text knows all these tricks, but the physician knows when to apply them and to what kind of person. And this is also the case of the dialectician as a technical type of rhetorician. So what is special about philosophical knowledge? I think it applies to pretty much any kind of knowledge, those conditions for it to be a good or bad, be it written or spoken, really. So how can you explain the difference, or do you see one?
Thank you very much, Annie, for the questions. A good question, and please do not call me Dr. Dotto. But so it's interesting. I don't know how much you studied the Phaedrus, but there is a huge debate about the criticism of writing in the Phaedrus and also in Plato's seventh letter, in the sense that Plato, the so-called non-written doctrines that were reserved simply through oral communication, for oral speeches, and that Plato did not hand out all his philosophical knowledge in his dialogues, but there was some part that he reserved for intra-academic teaching, so inside the academic with his fellow colleagues, for living in the academic, and that this oral communication in the academy concerns the fundamental principles of reality, as Aristotle's testimonial, you can see there. So that there is a difference in kind, according to this interpretation, between oral speech and written speech. So my point, and thank you because you gave me the opportunity to make it clear, I hope, is that written speech and oral speech, they are not different in kind, they are different in degree. So oral speeches are comparatively better, but they are not of a different kind of speech that would be immune to most of the flaws that the aspects of writings that I have outlined in a schema in the PowerPoint assigned to writing. So where does this lead us? Oral speech is superior according to Socratic Platonic standards in the Phaedrus. This for me is undeniable, but it's not any speech, because, for instance, even in the written dialogues by Plato that portray oral conversations between Socrates and, for instance, Ion or Gorgias, we can see that there are some defects of writings that can happen too in oral communication. So you being incapable of defending your thesis, elucidating your points, but oral speeches are better in general than written speeches because you have the author by them, so the soul that has formulated the speeches, who can, in principle, clarify doubts, elaborate on points, adjust the content to the soul it is speaking, just like I'm trying to do right now. And this is something, if you have simply read my presentation, my dissertation, you wouldn't get, because with the oral communication, it has some capacities that make it more appropriate to realize soul leading, so psychagogia, which is, according to Socrates, the nature, the physis, and the power, the capacity, the dynamism of speech. So oral speeches are better in that sense, but they are not of a different kind than written communication, than written speeches. And some oral speeches are better than others. So, for instance, Ion's Rhapsody from the dialogue, Ion's, or even Gorgias' set speech on the Eulogy of Ellen, and deliberations in political assemblies, they are comparatively worse than this one-to-one dialogical and dialectic conversation, as Socrates tries to do in the dialogues. So that's what I was trying to get. I hope that is clear now.
If I could just add, I understand what you said, but my question is, in what way is philosophy in a different position in connection with the limitations of oral or written speech than any other type of knowledge?
So, but
for example, medical
philosophy, you're speaking about Socratic philosophy in the dialogues nowadays, or like Platonic philosophy?
I'm talking about the dialectician as Socrates describes it in the Phaedrus. So someone who knows, someone who has inquired about what the good, for example, is, and the just is, and the unjust is and is not, and has made the effort to see all of the phenomena that seem to be different in the context of a unity, which he calls eidos, and then to divide according to kinds, to make all these distinctions. This is what the philosopher is good at doing and is supposed to be doing as a dialectician, and then could even develop this technical rhetoric to persuade others and to make sure that they are not led to error by others as well, which is an important function of rhetoric of the technical kind that is described in the Phaedrus. But what I'm asking is, in what way is, because your abstract talked about philosophical philosophy as a way of life, and I think philosophical knowledge, I'm not sure, but
philosophical knowledge, yes.
So how is philosophy in a different position in connection with the limitations of written and oral speech as any other type of knowledgeable practice, such as medicine? I don't think it is. I don't think there's anything that distinguishes philosophy or the dialectics here. It's about knowing or not knowing what you're talking about, and having the distinctions required to make things clear to others and persuade them. So that was my question.
Okay, so we'll try to answer it. I could mention that I have a chapter of my dissertation on the philosophy rhetoric analogy. I presented something also this weekend about this philosophy rhetoric analogy. And you're right, because medicine is considered by Plato to be a paradigmatic, big technical art. And Socrates uses medicine in analogy with rhetoric to think about what would be the epistemological foundations of rhetoric as an art. And philosophy is many times conceiving the dialogue as in parallel with medicine. Socrates is presented as a doctor of souls, the medicine of soul. But the Hippocratic treatises, they don't have anything like this doctrine of recollection that entails that truth already inheres in this student's soul. So to get at your question to begin to address your question, I say that the medical technique was practiced. Of course, it needs and this appears in the Phaedrus. It needs physis, episteme, and melete. So nature, knowledge, and practice. And Socrates claims that these three requirements, natural talents, knowledge, which I read as theoretical knowledge, and practice, apply to any other techne. But I guess the philosophy of the dialectics is involved in this metaphysical baggage with this doctrine of anamnesis that would make it unlike medicine. But you're right that medicine, just as philosophy, and that's why I think that medicine and the medical paradigm, medicine as a paradigm is so important, implies that medicine does not need only theoretical knowledge. And that's that point that I think you were mentioning, Annie, that Phaedrus says, Socrates says, if I told you that someone knew that some drugs can cause these effects, and that this drug can make someone puke, and this drug can make someone go to sleep, what would you say, Phaedrus? And then Phaedrus says, I would say that the person has simply read a book on medicine, but this does not mean that the person is a doctor, because it's different to be a doctor and to know all true propositions that apply concerning the relationship between drugs and bodies. So medicine, just as philosophy, require knowledge that and knowledge how, to propositional, non-propositional knowledge. But this point about the doctrine of recollect, and they require natural, this knowledge, practice, and natural capacity. Yeah, but it doesn't have this this doctrine of recollections and amnesis. The moral knowledge. Great. I agree with you. I'll go that route. So moral knowledge and knowledge of the ultimate structure of reality. It's a good point, Annie.
Pedro, did you read Annie's comment in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So, Annie, are you satisfied? Okay, so well there now.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I'm not quite very satisfied with the reply yet. So I was thinking about similar questions than the ones Annie formulated, or at least I see some connection between them. But first of all, I thought the presentation was very, very well done. I found this discussion at the beginning about the passivity of text very interesting, and I was not familiarized with it at all. This comparison with sexual activity, so that was very interesting. And I also was very excited that you went against the Tübingen and Milan school and your interpretation. But I think that the way you oppose them already connects with the point where I disagree with you. So I think that at least from my perspective, it seems that you are forcing too much of Hadot's position in what Plato is saying. So if I understood you correctly, you saw the written, so writing and orality in part, insofar as it shares the same defects or can share the same defects as written speech, as being a problem regarding the type of content. So you often said that they can, or you assume that it can communicate doctrines, or you almost identified speech with doctrines, and then the good modality of communication would imply something extra, so skills, something non-discursive. So as far as I understood, you were relying a lot on this opposition between doctrines and something propositional and something non-propositional. This goes against the way I read Plato, so I tend to be very adverse to interpretations that focus on non-propositional aspects. Not because I think that this is not an aspect of Plato. I think it is. It's a very important aspect. But all the non-propositional aspects related with skills, with the psychological profile of the person, and the extent in which it can be transformed, is not something else that must be communicated and that would be included in the perfect communication or even the perfect object that one would communicate. It's something that is necessary for us to understand what is being communicated in the first place. So I do not, when Plato's doctrines, or someone, assuming he has some, or someone else's doctrines are being communicated to me, what I think the text is saying in Phaedrus is that I cannot understand them. I cannot have access to them. So they distort the kind of knowledge that they are trying to communicate. They present simply an eidolon, a simulacrum, a shadow of that knowledge. So I cannot hear that doctrines themselves. I cannot hear the thesis. I cannot hear the arguments. So this is the problem with orality, with writing, and with orality insofar as it shares some defects in the same extent. So the problem is, how can we have true access to this kind of propositional knowledge, I would say, that is being communicated? And if you regard in the beginning of the discussion, so in 276a, for instance, when he refers to the notion of eidolon, he's opposing knowledge and logos. So episteme, or he speaks about logos met epistemes. We presuppose that it's possible to have logos without epistemes, so there's a kind of contraposition here. But later on, in the end passage, where he seems to present the good alternative, he speaks about a logos that is inside oneself. So it's the opposition between inner logos and outer logos. So the positive aspect, the positive communication or positive content of philosophy is not necessarily something that is non-propositional, or it's not primarily something that is non-propositional. It's also propositional. I would say it's the same as what can be communicated or orally or by written speech, but normally you cannot hear it unless we are prepared. So that is the problem. So all the non-propositional aspects are relevant as ways to give us access to the true propositional knowledge, I would say. And I think this is very different from what you were saying. And I was wondering if you agree with my reading of what you were saying, and what do you think about the alternative reading I'm proposing?
Great. Elder, thank you very much for this wonderful set of questions. So let's go slowly to clarify some things. My point is not that this propositional speech can produce something extra propositional only by itself, because the head that receives it, that it's the most important. And I agree with you that in the end, as some commentators have marked, what is in opposition is not oral speech and written speech, but two different forms of written speech. One which is written in the soul, the other which is written outside of the soul, in material supports. And this also goes back to Annie's question, that would be different from the life of the profession of the medicine and the life of the philosopher, because you can see that a professional doctor can do medicine from 9 a.m. until 6 p.m. and then go to sleep and be a horrendous person and I don't know, shout at people and be disgusting human being, failed human being. But a philosopher cannot do this. A philosopher cannot wear his clock out and then, okay, I'm a philosopher from 9 to 6 and then I'm something else. So philosophy requires this engaged and deep-seated commitment to a philosophical form of life. My point is that it's not that these propositionals are irreducible, or that philosophy is reducible to propositions. I'm not sure I can agree with you that the people who have not, let's say, made the epistrophe or turn their souls cannot listen this proposition, because they certainly can listen to them. They can read a philosophical book. I don't know what you mean by reading or listening in this case, because sensibly they can read them and they can listen to them. They cannot absorb them. They cannot, fully understand them, realize them. Then we will have to make a further distinction between what it is to understand something and to simply read it as something externally. But if that's the case, I agree with you that it's only in and that's why it's not only propositions and dispositions on propositional knowledge and non-propositional knowledge, knowledge that, knowledge how. I didn't elaborate this that much, but it's also the important part of the sensibility, the pathos, which goes back as well to your talk here at the seminar, which I pretty much enjoyed, because in the Phaedrus, the Pali notes, Eros is presented as a pathos, as a condition, as an experience that is necessary, about insufficient for one to become a philosopher. And that's something that goes beyond propositions or theories, doctrines. It's a certain way of attuning your soul, or directing the attention of your soul, or having a certain regard, a certain receptivity that makes one qualified to then engage in philosophical inquiry, in philosophical discussion, and get something out of it, for it not to be simply hearing without listening. So, to use your metaphor. So it is something more, but it's not simply communication that is at stake. It's also this mimesis of an exemplary form of life, and the willingness to engage in it. That, of course, you can communicate it through logos, but you cannot reduce it to logos. It's something else. There is an extra discourse. There are extra discursive elements to philosophy that no communication can extinguish or exhaust.
Okay, I can imagine
Thank
that Elder does not agree and would like to continue the discussion, but we are running out of time. There is a parallel discussion going on in the chat. I invite you all to read the comments by Sundar and Misku. I don't have opportunity to read them now because I still have to give the word to Pedro and Laura. I will need to ask you to be very brief now because we have 4 minutes remaining. Pedro.
Hey, hello, Marta, Pedro, nice seeing you.
And nice to see you.
Elder, nice to see you guys. I will be, yeah, let's have a drink soon. And Pedro too, when you get back here, let's talk more about those stuff. I will be really brief, so I'm sorry if it gets a little disorganized, but dude, I really liked your talk. One thing that immediately caught my attention is how this debate on the nature of this passage of the Phaedrus is in a certain way metaphilosophical, because what came to mind was this passage from Nietzsche's course on the dialogues of Plato, where he disagrees with Schleiermacher exactly on the interpretation of the passage, where the writing is a pharmacon, is a remedy for memory or rememoration. And he's doing that from the perspective of, yes, Schleiermacher is right. We have to read Plato from this living point of view. But at the same time, when Schleiermacher organizes the books thinking of them, he says Schleiermacher, to be really short, didn't get Plato becoming Plato. Plato werdende Plato. And I think this is a certain thing that interests me in your talk, is that if we take away the actual intuitive aspect of philosophy, we also can leave out the actual living experience. We basically stop treating Plato as a human, you know, as a human that not only develops in a certain way, but which also has the same limitations as us. And what I get from your talk is exactly that you're in that direction. We have to think Plato as becoming Plato. So, to shorten this up, when you cite that Phaedrus 9.1c, think little of Socrates, but more of the truth, I would put this question as a Nietzschean, the classical Nietzschean question: what if truth is a woman? I mean, think of Socrates less and more of the truth. There's a certain there's almost like a specific erotical position, right? I mean, it's like Socrates. I mean, that's a position, but at the same time, if you allow me to joke a little, it's almost like Socrates' description of writing language in the Phaedrus is like she's an orphan whore, in the sense that if we take this metaphor of the woman, it's like it's almost like there is a certain idea of woman that sort of fluctuates in Plato's notion of writing and truth. That's it, man. We talk more later, but thank you again, man.
Thank you very much, Pedro. It's a pleasure. We'll certainly speak more about it. Please send me later this passage from Nietzsche and Schleiermacher, because it's very interesting. And you're right. I think that it tags on the point that I was trying to get. And the question basically is, time is short, Plato's dialogues are a piece of museum. Are Plato's dialogues like a museum with old theories that have interest only for historians and archaeologists, or are Plato's dialogues an invitation that have interest and intimation for philosophers and for philosophizing, not simply a historical, archaeological interest, or rather a lively philosophical interest for us today? So one perspective, you get it simply an archaeological, so it's something from the past, and another one is a philosophy, something we engage with and that can be provoked by and stimulated by and think with in a dialogical sense, despite the limitations of the dead letters, the still letters of his text. So these are different approaches to how one reads Plato, either platonically, that is philosophically, or archaeologically as a piece of museum that it's of worth only for historians. And simply now on truth to end, because I already spoke too much today. So aletheia, of course, it is a feminine noun in ancient Greek. But I would say that from a Platonic perspective, and going back to these slides can be kind of provocative, that truth for Plato and against Nietzsche is not a woman, but truth is like angels, like it doesn't have a gender, it doesn't have a sex, it's pre-gender and or non-binary at all from this point of view. It's simply material. But this, of course, I'm just trying to put Nietzsche and Plato into conversation in some question that goes far beyond my capacities. It's just going with the flow of your question because it's an interesting provocation. Pedro, thank you.
Okay, I know this discussion could go on for hours. I would also have my questions. Laura Mueller has kindly ceded her question, but if you want to make it very, very quickly, or
that's okay. I will think on it more, and maybe I'll email you, Pedro, if I can actually add some sophistication to it. And I appreciate that this seminar starts and ends on time, and I don't want to.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I also think that's important. So thank you also for your understanding. I will also discuss with Pedro my own questions maybe afterwards. I will then close this session. Thank you, Pedro, for such an excellent seminar and discussion. Thank you all for being there and participating also in the discussion. We will have one last session before the end of the academic year. It will take place on the 10th of July with a talk by Michael Chase. I hope to see you all then. Until then, take care. Thank you and bye-bye. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.